I'm a media content lawyer. I've been in this industry for about a decade now. I've worked on the regulatory side, and I've also worked on the programme advice side as well, advising broadcasters and production companies on content legal issues and also compliance with the broadcasting regulations. I hope that what you'll get out of this session is an understanding of some of the common media law and sort of Ofcom issues that come up that I've sort of seen in my career. Some of the common pitfalls. What are the issues? What kind of things should you be thinking about so that you can kind of avoid potential legal action or regulatory complaints coming your way? As you know, television is quite tightly regulated by Ofcom. They're a really tough regulator, actually. They are very fair. I used to work there, so they are very scrupulous and they do have a lot of powers. But at the same time, they do understand TV content, so I don't think they're unnecessarily restrictive. But there are quite a few sections of the Ofcom code that will relate to your programming. And it's important to say that these sort of issues on the Ofcom broadcasting code, they will relate to scripted programmings, they will relate to news and current affairs, they'll relate to formatted programs, documentaries, everything. If you are doing a program that is filming under 18s, and also I think maybe wider vulnerable people as well, but particularly under 18s, the Ofcom code says very explicitly you must take due care over the physical and emotional welfare of people that are under 18. That's irrespective of any consent given by the child, their parent, guardian, or any other person. And also, people that are under 18 mustn't be caused unnecessary distress or anxiety by their involvement in programs or by the broadcast of the program. It's a pretty onerous rule, you might say, but it is necessary, and it's one that Ofcom are very, very strict about enforcing. So if you're doing even a scripted program, you know, a drama, a comedy, a soap that involves children, you still have these very strict obligations. So that might mean that you think about the age of the child actors that you have. They may be professionals, but it doesn't mean that you don't have a responsibility to think about the scripting that you have, the sort of language that's used around them. If they're involved in maybe quite a sensitive scene, that they possibly involve some, understand some of the sensitivities that are involved. You know, they have the kind of capacity to understand maybe storylines that are a little bit more sensitive. So in a scripted world, it's just as important. And when it comes to documentaries and other types of longer form programming, formatted programming, particularly actually formatted programming where you may be putting children into a more artificial situation, so it's not just an observational documentary. One of the things that you might want to look at are the use of psychologists, program psychologists, advisors that can really inform you as a producer about the capacity of that young person to consent. Obviously, anyone that's sort of under 16, 17, really, you need the consent of their parent or their legal guardian in order for them to take part. But it's depending on the nature of the program that you've got, you really want to have somebody that can evaluate how robust that child is. You know, do they really know what they're getting themselves into? Could they cope with being in a program, particularly with the advent of social media? Is this something that they would be able to handle as a character? So those things are really important when dealing with children. Just a note on getting consent as well. So I mentioned that under the age of 18, basically Ofcom considers to be a young person, and therefore you have these obligations in respect to their welfare. But in terms of actually getting consent, it's a bit of a grey area when it comes to 16 and 17-year-olds. So if you have a 16 and 17-year-old that perhaps live independently, you can, in such instances, and they have capacity to consent, they can themselves sign. You wouldn't need to necessarily get additional consent from their parent, but definitely under the age of 16, you absolutely have to get consent from a parent, their guardian, or other person. In terms of finding out, who has the authority to give consent, if you have a child that is in maybe a separated or their parents are divorced, it's really important to find out who has kind of legal guardianship. Do both parents have, and that, in which case you'd need both parents to consent? Or is it that, one parent really is the person responsible for that child's welfare and signing off on them from a legal point of view? So it's really important to sort of get an idea, this child, who's in their family, who's around them, and make sure that you're getting consent from the right person. It sounds obvious, but, I've definitely been in instances where consent maybe has only been sought from one parent and not the other, and it can put you in a little bit of a sticky situation, because that other parent may have grounds to completely say they don't want that person participating, they don't want their child participating in the program, and then you're stuck in a little bit of a nightmare. So it's really important to get consent from the right people, from the right guardians and parents, etc. Just a note on, I've also mentioned, it's not about under 18s here, but where we're talking about people not being caused unnecessary distress or anxiety. In the UK, as you probably know, reality programs have come under a lot of scrutiny, and particularly in relation to participants and participant welfare. Duty of care in particular is a massive area, and the regulator currently is looking at rules to see whether they are sufficient, whether new rules need to come in. It's a really, really huge area. It's an important area, not least ethically, as well as from a regulatory perspective. So it's worth keeping an eye out to see if rules come in and if they change, because that will be a very big area that I'm sure will relate to a lot of programming. A big ethos of protecting the under 18s from an Ofcom perspective is also children in audiences that are actually watching programs. And as you know, in the UK, we have a watershed, which is 9 p.m. So all content that goes on before 9 p.m, you always have to bear in mind that there may be children in the audience, and therefore your content has to be, it doesn't have to be cartoons, etc., but it does have to be content which is suitable if a child was to pop in and watch what you were doing. So the watershed and enforcing the watershed is a big part of protecting under 18s that are watching, but it's also a really important part of just content in terms of harm and offence generally. So one important thing that I've just talked about is whether harm and offence issues come up is the time of the programme. So as I've just said, if you've got something going on at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of a more adult nature, that's going to possibly breach section 1 on protecting under 18s, and it may cause people harm and offence because their audience expectation at 4 o'clock is going to be very different to what somebody expects to watch maybe at 10 o'clock. So when you're making content, big thing to know is, what, and you don't always know, it depends on the broadcaster you're working for. You may not always know when you're a producer, but it's a good idea to have an idea, is this going to be more of an adult program? Is this more for kids? Because that's going to affect some of the material that you put on. Yeah, exactly. So this is the type of material that quite often raises complaints. So it's I would say gratuitous sex and gratuitous violence, even past the watershed, quite often gets a lot of complaints. A note on that, I mean, that doesn't mean you're not going to have discussions maybe about sex or some violence. I mean, in the news, for example, you may see some violence, and that news programme may go on, well before the watershed. And I think in certain programming, there's obviously a higher tolerance and a higher expectation that you may see violence, and there's a higher editorial justification, and the code does recognise that. And even in relation to sex, if you're doing an educational show and it's pre-watershed, then there may be instances where you can still have content as long as it's not gratuitous and there's a sort of educational, possibly, public interest messaging associated with it, then you might be able to do that pre-watershed. Often a lot of dramas or soaps will come into this territory as well, comedies, that are pre-watershed. I've even seen cartoons where this issue has come up. So again, it's just time to think about what time is the programme. If it's before the watershed, is it gratuitous? Are we showing too much? Has it got an educational purpose maybe that might trump the fact that it's being shown at this time? They're all the kind of factors that you probably need to have a look at. Another area of harm and offence that comes up quite a lot is language. Again, I won't say it, any of them now, but some of the really strong swear words you obviously cannot say before 9 p.m. So that's just a very, very simple, it's a very, very black and white rule, to be honest. There's a really great document that the Ofcom has, which is called the Ofcom Language Research Document. It points out a lot of words, and it basically explains from research that they've done what the general public, what general people think about certain words. Particularly when it comes to discriminatory language, what you could maybe say in programming in the 70s and 80s is not the same as would be seen as acceptable now. Those things do change, and there's quite a recent document, I think it was done in 2016 or 2017, that sort of outlines what people generally think about certain language. It's a really good resource actually if you're unsure. The other things that can give rise to harm and offence complaints are, if you're particularly again in pre-watershed programming, if you're showing quite dangerous behaviour or maybe harmful behaviour, so things like perhaps drug taking, that might give rise to a kind of complaint around harm and offence. Again, context is really specific. You've got to always think about, why am I showing this? What's the purpose of me showing this? And again, what's the time? What time is this intended to go out for? Also, what sort of show is this? Is this a show that's sort of more aimed at children and family viewing, or is this, a more hard-hitting current affairs or observational documentary, or a post-watershed drama that perhaps the audience have a higher expectation for? Generally, anything to do with animals or animal cruelty is very likely to garner a lot of complaints. So if you have animals in your programme, or you're showcasing animals in distress in relation to a news or an observational documentary, be very, very careful around that area as well, because people do seem to have a very low tolerance when it comes to seeing animals as well in distress. So fairness, it's mainly around the people that you have in your programs. What it's trying to do in the fairness section of the code is to think about, have you portrayed, somebody that's agreed to be in your program? Have you portrayed them fairly? Did they know what they were going to be involved in when you did a program? Have you kind of reflected their position kind of carefully in the program? You know, what does it look like basically when the program's done? Is that fair? Have your kind of dealings been fair with them? It has a lot of elements to it. So this is why I've got this kind of rather strange flowchart. But I think I've really found it helpful in terms of fairness to follow this, because it really sort of puts your mind through the production and kind of editing process as to whether you're being fair. So, you know, the first thing we've got here is, you know, informed consent. We've talked a bit about informed consent when it comes to children, but one thing you need to say right from the beginning, you know, you've got a program idea, maybe you've been commissioned to do something. The first thing you really need to do is say, okay, what's the program about? Because without being able to give a clear description to somebody about what your documentary is about, or what your new FactAnt program is about, it's very hard to be able to evidence that, you know, somebody's been able to give informed consent. So the first thing is, easiest way to do this really is on the release form. Often it will say program, but, you know, really good practice is to put a description on your release form. Then, you know, everybody's working, your contributor knows what the program's about, you know what the program's about, and, you know, everyone's working from the same basis. So that's the first thing on informed consent. The second thing really, which is very important, is, you know, do they have the capacity to consent? So we've talked again about kids, but you know, even with adults or possibly more vulnerable people, you know, are they in a position where they consent? Is it a good idea for them to consent? So that's the first thing that you want. Also, are there any conditions attached? So you may get a contributor that says, yeah, I really want to do this program or this report, but I'm only willing to do it on an anonymous basis. That raises a lot of other legal issues, as you might imagine. But again, you know, at that stage, you know, don't guarantee, you shouldn't really be guaranteeing anything at this stage unless you can actually keep to it. So if you can, and that's okay, and you've had discussions, you know, with your production company or the broadcaster or whoever it is, then just be really clear about what anonymity means. Quite often people will use a lot of TV speak and say, yeah, of course, you know, nobody will be able to identify you, but haven't necessarily taken measures that are clear. So, for example, you might be thinking, yeah, you know, I'll blur your face and maybe I'll pitch shift your voice, but you may not tell them that, well, they'll still be identifiable because we might be filming in their kitchen or in their vicinity, or then, you know, something else might come up which may render them identifiable. Or perhaps they have an idea that their voice will be completely different or may be voiced by an actor's voice. Again, it's making it clear to people how and what measures you're going to take really when it comes to anonymity or people being anonymous. That's the first thing around informed consent. People knowing what the program's about, people realizing what their participation is, and having an idea, if they've asked for anonymity, realizing if that's been granted, what they'll look like. The other thing to look at when you're going through this process is, you know, am I editing their contribution fairly? Is there something that I've left out that might give a different impression, and by leaving it out, it looks unfair to them? Really important to know that if somebody made an Ofcom complaint, particularly a fairness complaint, it may be that the regulator has asked for the rushes. So I always think, and it can also happen in a litigation context as well, so, you know, always keep in mind that if somebody else was to come in and was to look at the rushes would they maybe have a different view and think, well, actually you didn't include this bit and that was actually fairly important to their point, or how they're portrayed, or how they came across in the actual edited version of the programme. So that's one to watch out for. Right to reply is going to come up mainly in news and current affairs programmes, but it has come up also in the odd documentary, so I wouldn't necessarily rule it out. Right to reply is going to come up. You're going to need a right to reply if you're actually making an allegation about somebody. If you're making an allegation about a person or a company, and you need to kind of reflect their view, or you've got evidence about them and you need their comment on, you're probably going to need a right to reply. And that again forms part of the fairness process. It's also really important from a libel perspective, which I'll come on to shortly. There's quite a lot of overlap between fairness and libel. And one of the things about libel that's looked at in terms of responsible journalism is whether you've given a right to reply. So this is quite handy, as I say, for things like libel as well. So, is there an allegation that's being made about a company or a person that you need to give a right to reply to? Have you given them a reasonable time to respond to that? Some quick news stories, you don't need a lot of time to respond. Other things that have got very lengthy investigations, you might need a bit more time. Sort of depends what you're doing and what the allegations are and what the evidence is. Who it is, etc. And the last thing is, have you reflected their position or their right to reply if you've gone for one in the programme? So kind of, have you done that? And if you've done those things, generally speaking, you'll probably be on the right side of fairness. And you shouldn't really have much cause for concern in terms of a fairness complaint. It's worth spending time on this because, as I say, it comes into kind of every kind of facet. I mean, I've seen, even things as innocuous as say, maybe you're doing a dating show and somebody, a contestant or whatever, reveals that a family relative of theirs has a disease or an illness. That should signal to you that's private information, sensitive information. I need to get express consent that we're allowed to put that in the programme. So it can happen. It can happen quite a lot. So when you're looking at privacy, as I've said before, the first factor in privacy is, do you have, you or the information, is there a reasonable expectation of privacy? The factors that we look at are, well, perhaps is it something that's happening in a public place? If it is, just kind of walking down the street, you're just general kind of shots of people walking down the street with no other information about them. It's not in a sort of sensitive context. It's unlikely really to attract an expectation of privacy unless, you've got somebody distressed in the street that's crying or something else. But generally speaking, in a public place, less likely to have an expectation of privacy. Talked about distress. Is it information like medical, financial sort of information? If it is, again, it's likely to attract, as we say, quite a high expectation of privacy. Or is the information in the public domain? If it's in the public domain, horse is bolted already. It's really, really hard to try and say, well, it's private if perhaps, 2 million people have watched it on a YouTube video or something. It's going to be quite difficult to argue privacy in such circumstances unless there's something, some sort of odd issue or new information that you're adding to it. But generally speaking, that's what privacy is all about. It's sort of, the first hurdle is, do you have an expectation of privacy? If the answer is yes, you sort of go on to the second stage, which is, okay, you've got an expectation of privacy. Do I have a justification? And quite often the justification will be, well, yes, this person has an expectation of privacy in those circumstances. Let's take, for example, secret filming or covert filming. Perhaps, you know, you did some undercover filming in relation to a public figure that has a lot of influence. Secret filming, I'll just say now, if you're ever going to do that, please seek legal advice. It's not easy. It's not something that's done very lightly. So in the first instance, don't go around doing secret filming just off your own sort of back. Do get some good advice about that. But quite often you will have seen, particularly in news and current affairs programming, secret filming being used. They would have had an expectation of privacy. They wouldn't necessarily have known they've been being filmed in that way. They're probably revealing something quite sensitive. If you're going to override that, you're going to have a very good public interest justification. Going to again depend on who the person is that you filmed or what exactly they're revealing. But if it is a proportionate interference and you've revealed crime, wrongdoing, incompetence, and that incompetence has a big effect on the general public in particular, that's going to be quite a high public interest justification that would override either a legal claim around privacy or, as I said, an Ofcom complaint. So privacy, really, really, really big area. The other thing to say is, I mean, even if you're not doing something big like secret filming, I mean, privacy infringements happen quite sometimes innocently. So if you're filming in a hospital, for example, or you're filming even in a religious institution, a church or a mosque or whatever, the place itself attracts a high expectation of privacy, the being sensitive places. So if you haven't got consent from people to film in there, even people kind of in the background may have a privacy infringement claim by the very fact that you've just shown their face in quite a sensitive place and they weren't aware of it and they didn't consent. So worth really thinking about your protocols when you go to film in certain places. Are there notices? Has there been an announcement that you're filming? You know, have you got a log of people that you spoke to and got consent from? So really, really important area, just in those sort of wider shots as well that you might have in your programs. You'll come across obviously lots of different legal issues when you're filming and broadcasting. I'm picking up on the most relevant as I see it relating to kind of program making and programs that you're broadcasting. So they are libel, which we've spoken a little bit about, contempt of court, privacy we've already spoken about, so no need to do that. You know, quick sort of point to identify libel. You know, the basic thing is it defamatory? So have I said something that's going to cause serious harm to somebody's reputation? Different examples of that, obviously somebody who's committed a crime, or you're saying someone's committed a crime, is like, and that's not true, that's defamatory and it's libelous. Saying somebody's having an extramarital affair, that is defamatory. So, you know, first of all, look and think, what is it that I'm saying about this person, this individual, this company? You know, am I saying a company is very unethical? They treat their staff in a very unethical way, or perhaps are even breaking laws? You know, what is it that I'm saying? Is it defamatory? If it is defamatory, can I rely on truth as a defence? There are other defences in libel. There is also a public interest defence. We talked earlier, in fairness, about the right to reply process. So if you are perhaps doing a programme that's got a lot of public interest value in it, you know, and you've done quite a lot of responsible journalism around it, including trying to get a comment from the person who's a target of your programme or report, that will count as being, you know, acting in a way that's responsible journalism, and you may have a public interest defence. There's also defences like qualified privilege and absolute privilege. Absolute privilege is a complete defence. We're going to talk about it in a moment around court, but obviously everything that's said in court, so in a trial, you can imagine there's a lot of defamatory things that are said there. And if you're doing a report about something that's happened in court, a contemporaneous report, then you will be protected by the very fact that material is subject to absolute privilege. But the one that's going to be the one really you have to look at is truth, because it's a complete defence. It's easier said than done, truth. So obviously truth is going to rely on lots of things. What evidence do you have? Is it from a contributor? If it's from one contributor, could you maybe corroborate it and get some other documents or evidence that will give you more to make it sort of certain that you could rely on truth as a complete defence? So it's important to look at what you've got, to corroborate what you have as well, not just rely on say one person. If you've got somebody giving you an accusation or somebody telling you something, it's important that you're able to corroborate that. But again, as with privacy, I mean, I think people quite often, when you're doing big investigations or big reports, you'd obviously have to really get legal advice. I mean, this is what I do. I sort of get involved quite early on and advise on things like that. But if you're doing other types of programs, quite often libel happens, again, quite innocently. So the classic is using the wrong photo. So if you're talking about say, I don't know, fraudsters in a local area, and you have somebody with quite a common name, you know, Mike Smith, and you go and you Google and you get an image and you put it on and it's the wrong person, that's automatically a libel. So as I say, it can happen quite casually. Photographs of people, names that you use, again, corroborate. It also happens, I think, quite generally. So I've seen sometimes programs that might be just about a general issue that your program is about. Perhaps it's about, trying to think of an example, I can't think of one right now, but perhaps it's about, I don't know, rogue landlords, and you're just doing a general piece, and then a kind of general shot comes and you've got an estate agent, or you've got you know, somebody that just comes into view. If people make the wrong kind of conclusion that, well, that person or this letting agent or whatever is part of a rogue landlord, then they might have a claim. So you have to be really, really careful with just general shots and the context and what you're saying. So if you're doing any general shots, check the what are you saying here, to make sure that you don't have a mistaken libel, because what you intend to do is sort of irrelevant here. Coming on to contempt of court. So really, if you've got somebody is on trial for something, that really should send alarm bells to you, because the issue around contempt of court is really around prejudicing a trial. So either an upcoming trial or an ongoing trial. So the first thing you need to think is, okay, am I revealing things that would be considered a contempt of court are things like a motive for a crime, previous convictions that somebody has, anything that might lead you to prejudging, that says the outcome of a case, leading to think that someone that's on trial, that person is guilty. You know, the whole point of contempt of court is that the jury are judging a person's guilt or innocence on the evidence that they hear in court, not on things that they see on the television. So that's a really, really important thing. If you're doing any of the other reason that's important is if you're, say, doing a maybe you're doing one of these police observational documentary series, you're following the police, you know, you'll quite often want to follow a person's case from beginning to end. You're only ever going to be able to broadcast that once a trial has finished. So that's why if you're doing any of those programs, it's always really, really important to know what stage you're at. I think most people are very aware of the fact that you can't broadcast a program including that individual or references to that case if it's going to substantially prejudice their trial. It's also not just about criminal trials. There's a lot of reporting restrictions that are put in place in relation to family proceedings as well, and sort of health issues, the court of protection. So things like custody arrangements or kids that are being put into care, they are all subject to reporting restrictions. You're not able to identify particularly kids under 18 that are subject to criminal proceedings and also family proceedings as well. So really important to think, you know, is this person or this family or whoever that I've got included, are they in an upcoming trial? Is my programme focusing on that? Am I going to be in breach of any reporting restrictions, and seek early legal advice, really. Copyright's obviously really important. It's there really to protect people's original work, their creative work. There's a legal maxim, what's worth copying is worth protecting. The first one, there's no copyright in ideas, facts or opinions. Copyright usually expires 70 years after the creator of the work dies. There are some exceptions in terms of sound recordings and other things. Good rule of thumb is if the creator of the work's been sort of dead 100 years, you know, you're on safe ground really to use that. Don't need to register a copyright work. It's not like a trademarks or patents that you have to actually register in order to get the legal protection. You'll be familiar with the sort of little C, the copyright sign. You know, again, it's great as an indication, but you don't actually need it to get that legal protection. Incidental inclusion of copyright work. This is something that comes up a lot. So I often have people that are maybe doing an observational documentary or a program where there might be some music in the background. If you as a producer don't have any choice over it, and it really is just background, then you won't need to really get that cleared because it will be counted as incidental inclusion. And the fifth helpful thing to know is that you could use the defence of fair dealing, which allows you to use some material for the purpose of reporting a current event. The star's there because it doesn't apply to photographs for reporting current events, or critique and review where you can use photographs or other things. It obviously comes with a number of caveats, one being that you need to credit the copyright kind of owners on that, and you only, you know, you need to use a fair amount, so enough to make your sort of point that you're making about it. But again, it's kind of worth knowing, and a good defence actually. And also recently they've had the defence of parody. So parody is quite new. I think it's maybe 2-3 years. So if you are parodying a work, you know, you're taking something original and then you're adding some sort of comedic or mocking effect to it, then you don't need to seek authorisation. So I've had a question that says, how can you ensure that under 18s won't be affected by bullying after the broadcast, and what are the regulations and aftercare processes around this? It's a great question. To be honest, you can't necessarily ensure that, which is why having psychological evaluations and getting a feel for how robust people are is really, really important. Social media has affected this. So the fact is that I always say to people, you know, you have to manage expectations as a producer and as a production company, and as a broadcaster even, you're very, very limited. So that's why the first thing I'd say is, when it comes to actually how robust are the people and the under 18s that you've got, what's the subject matter, and speaking to a professional, and maybe not just even somebody that's a psychologist who can give you an idea of the person's character and how robust they are, but also their support network with you know, children. You know, do they have a good support network, a good family? You know, if you're doing something, do you maybe have to notify their school? So sometimes the advice has been notifying a particular school or their teachers about their inclusion of a program to sort of monitor. That teacher can maybe have a bit more monitoring when it comes to that particular child. So there are a few things. It's why I said that, you know, this area is developing, but it's really worth having a proper protocol, having a proper understanding of your program, of your the child that's involved, of their situation. You know, are they already vulnerable? You know, are they in a situation where perhaps maybe being in the program might not be the best thing for them kind of at the moment? These are all things that really need to be discussed. Duty of care and welfare anyway is something that is being looked at industry-wise, and I know is being looked at Ofcom, so it's a sort of watch this space. I've got another question which I will take actually about if you want to create a drama based on a dramatised real life event that you yourself have been a part of, it's not something that's been documented, and filled the gaps with your own imagination. Does fairness play a part in this for the other parties involved in the event? Do the other parties need to know what I'm planning on doing, even though things will be dramatised and name change, etc.? Could I be accused of libel and defamation? Again, really complicated. I have advised on dramas and on scripted. They can, particularly with real events, if in short, if the drama that you're doing, if it's based on somebody real and that's identifiable, or it's inspired by real events, then yes, you can get into tricky water when it comes to defamation and fairness. I think there's a lot of parts to your question. Do the other parties need to know what I'm planning on doing, even though things will be dramatised and names changed? Again, it depends. I mean, it depends how identifiable people are as well. That's one big thing. The other thing that I would say is it depends what you're revealing. If you're going to do something which is very sensitive or private, or it's something quite distressing that might lead those other people to relive quite a traumatic event, then you may need to inform them. The code does talk about informing victims or people of past events. And if, as I said, if it's a privacy issue, if you're revealing something private about their life, and they're identifiable, you've talked about name changing, that might help, but it might not help as well. But if they are identifiable and you're revealing quite private information, you would need to get consent. But again, there's a lot of issues here, but I would just say in short, when it comes to defamation and fairness, scripted kind of programs that are based on real people or real events do have the same, very, very similar kind of obligations in terms of libel and fairness. So I've got another one here that says, if I'm making an allegation against a company and my claims have already been made public by other media productions, do I still need to use the right to reply? It depends what they've said, what the company has said before. So if you're going to include their position on the matter and you've got nothing more new to add, then no, you don't need to go back to the right to reply. What you should do though is basically reflect what they've said before. So that's what I'd say. If you're having any new elements, so if you're doing something that you're developing a little bit further, and it's not just about things that have been in the public before, if you're adding to that, then yes, I think you would need to go for a right to reply. But as long as you're reflecting their position, if they've already said something before, then you don't need to have a separate right to reply. So hopefully you have found that helpful. Thank you very much for joining me.